Folks, welcome to a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. And my guest today is an unheralded melodic improviser in music history. His career has spanned the last 5 decades and continues to go strong in a myriad of ways. He grew up during a time of gut-bucket invention when jazz music was played on the street and there were many cats that were strung out because they couldn't afford health care. A gentleman, a guy who goes way back, Gary Foster, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you very much.
Can you talk a little bit about the earliest records? I mean, were you the first tunes that you listened to? Were they were they Dixieland, or were they more like swing era, or even bebop?
Well, my hook to music was a junior high school band director. I think I was probably in the 8th grade, somewhere around late 13 or 14, and he was a very good high school band director. I took clarinet lessons from him, and he decided to have, in order to play for assemblies at the school, to have a little band he called the Teen Timers, and there are very few arrangements published in, but he bought a few, and I have a photo of it. It's just about 8 or 10 people, and my parents bought me a used tenor saxophone, which I liked very much, and playing the music, and he played the records on the radio. I heard the people improvise, various people, and I got hooked on that. And I asked him a question about how do you do that, and he said, "Well, you either have that ability or you don't." So I just started trial and error playing with records at the house, and it's really how I got hooked.
What did he? Do you feel he's talking about the ability to improvise? You either have it or you don't. So, like,
did I have? Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's like, I mean, but I mean, do you think that if people, but you have to find out if you have it, right? I mean, you go and you practice and you figure out if you have it or not, right?
Well, it's trial and error, and in those days there were, I think, probably the only schools, by the time I graduated high school, I think there was one school that offered jazz education. This was in 1954. There was one in Los Angeles and one in New York. And I was aware from reading downbeats that there were John Mehegan and Lenny Castano and people taught privately. I didn't know their music at all. But I remember a very early influence was hearing Stan Getz and the lyricism of his playing. I remember I had an album cover that had a white plastic mouthpiece on it with his photo with it. I took a bus and went to Kansas City and went to a music store and asked for a white plastic mouthpiece. And I actually purchased one, which turned out not to be the same facing as his, but it was similar. And, I was just looking for anything that would help. And by the time I was 15, I had a little trio, and we played for a dance or two, and an older man in the community called me, said he'd heard our band, and could I play with his band at the VFW Hall? This is in Leavenworth, Kansas, a small town. They played every Friday and Saturday night, older men. They needed a saxophone player. There was no music. I was probably junior in high school, probably. Whatever age that would have been, 14 or 15. Mm-hmm. And we played every Friday and Saturday night, the tunes of the day. And anything I didn't know one week, I faked it. And then I went and got the sheet music or got a record and listened to it and just took it off by ear. So those were my beginnings in the period long before jazz education. Of course, now many schools have.
Well, yeah, I want to ask you. You're the perfect person to ask about. At 38 years old, I feel like a lot of language in all musics has been stifled to a degree for a variety of reasons, and one of them, I think, is because music is now being taught in academia. And I was hoping you could talk about a lesson that you learned from a mentor of yours on the bandstand that you probably could never learn today because of the lack of venues and the lack of touring circuit, but just the idea of how your education as opposed to today's education, which is much more formulaic.
Well, I went to school at a small college in the central Missouri, dedicated to playing jazz. I played first clarinet in the wind ensemble, which was part of my training. I enjoyed that very much. It was classical playing. And I knew after 2 years I wasn't getting an education that was going to make me a performing musician. So I moved to the University of Kansas, where I enrolled as a clarinet major, and I have a degree in clarinet performance and one in music education. I had a wonderful clarinet teacher, a great performer, and very, very dedicated. I had a wonderful experience playing in the orchestra. We played Beethoven symphonies and Brahms, and with a wonderful conductor. So that was background. And every spare hour I was playing with jazz guys in the practice rooms at the school. The trumpet player Carmel Jones was a student there when I was.
Oh my God! Wait, hold on for a second. You were part of the classic Nathan Davis, Carmel Jones, Donald Dean era?
Yeah, Donald Dean wasn't there. I know his name and I know I met him.
Yeah.
But Nathan was very much there, and Carmel. And in 1960, Carmel and I in the rhythm section took a quintet to the Notre Dame Jazz Festival. And I remember we were so concerned about whether we were going to play the hippest music there. I took an Ornette Coleman blues off the record, and these were still basically the kind of impulses that were polished through trial and error. There was certainly no one at school, and all of my profs, if you said the word jazz, they just thought that was a joke, because it was a classical education. And during that period, I met the band leader, Stan Kenton.
Wow.
He heard a tape of the group that we took to Notre Dame. And Carmel was the kind of musician who was so natural that anything that passed through his ears would come out the trumpet instantly. There's that aspect to some people's talent, and that's a gift.
Right. But what about the idea of that you guys were all autodidactic, too? I mean, you had to listen to this stuff on the radio. There was no playback. I mean, you had to learn it. Your ears were not locked. I mean, I think that's the most invigorating thing about your generation is that, I mean, the landscape, you were making up the rules, Gary. You guys were making up the rules. I mean, to me, it's like that is, I mean, it's emblematic of the fact that you all had your own individual sounds. I just wonder if, I mean, was Quincy Jones at that college jazz festival?
No, I can't. Some of the judges were like the publisher of Downbeat, but in the year before that, I had a tape of the local jazz festival at one of the universities in the Midwest, and the tape of that was taken by a man named Matt Betton, who was a person who started the National Association of Jazz Educators, and he took it to the first Stan Kenton camp and played it for Stan. And Stan said, "Tell a tenor player to come and see me sometime." So the next time his band played as a dance near Kansas City, I went and I said, "Mr. Kenton, my name is Gary," and he said, "Oh, you're the tenor player." And this turned out, in my experience since, to have happened to many, many young players. Stan's friendliness, and he was so loved by everybody. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but Shelley Mann wrote a eulogy for Stan when he died, and I worked with Shelley a lot, and he was so complimentary of Stan as a leader. I'm not sure he loved the music, but the person. But anyway, Stan said, "Hey, you got your horn in the car?" And I was terrified, but I did. And I sat in with the band, and he said, well, I'll try to get you in the band as soon as I can, you know. And at one point I had a graduate assistantship at the university. This is kind of a long, involved little story.
It's all right, yeah.
But, and I was teaching half-time in a public school in my second year of graduate school. And, you know, I was earning money and finishing and had a master's program in conducting and in musicology. And all of that was totally related to classical music. And so when I was finishing my second year of graduate school, or third year, whatever it was, the university said, why don't you go get a PhD? And there was a university that had a special woodwind program in the East. And they thought that the PhD from there was very strong, and they told me I could come back and teach clarinet at the University of Kansas if I did that. And I really I didn't think I wanted to be in a world where I couldn't play both classical and jazz music. So I went to see Stan. My wife and I were just making a decision, and he said, well, look, he said, you got these degrees. He said, if you want to live your dream, it's New York or Los Angeles. And we had a friend here, Bill Hardy. By then, Carmel had been here a year. And Bill Hardy, who started in Revelation Records. Did you mention that yesterday?
No, well, that's my favorite. That's where I discovered the Keltner-Foster relationship. I love that.
Yeah. That came earlier. I mean, when I first came out here, my wife and I just backed up against everybody's wishes of a U-Haul trailer and a 4-year-old daughter and came to the West Coast.
Well, let's not jump ahead. I mean, finish this story about. So what woodwind school were they telling you to go to?
It was the University of Iowa. There was a very famous teacher there named Jaime Voxman.
Wow.
Most people who would know of his publications. And it would have been the place to go. And, of course, in those days, I think it would have been possible to do. But we just decided that if I needed to spend a year of hardship on the street. But anyway, that's very interesting that one of the first people I met was Keltner, because I was teaching very quickly after we came here in a music store, and one teacher had quit, and I taught a couple students for him. They gave me his load of clarinet and saxophone and flute students. Or not flute, because I didn't play it yet. But Keltner was there working in the store, and of course every moment we were together we talked about jazz. The bass player Albert Stinson, you remember that name?
God, I mean, a tragic loss. People, Keltner said he was half the nights he was just trying to save his life from him overdosing. But the guy was, I interviewed John Handy, and I don't have the quote on me right now, but they were doing a symphonic. Handy was involved with the symphony orchestra up in San Francisco, and Stinson was not. I'm not going to do justice to the story, but the cat was a ridiculous. I mean, he was a just had monster chops. I want to read this. This is the quote I do have teed up for Gary Foster. This is what it says.
Is this from Keltner or something?
Of course it's from Keltner. I first met Gary Foster when he was teaching clarinet on the second floor of the Barium Grassman Music Store in Pasadena on Colorado and Lake. I was the snare drum teacher. We worked down the hall from each other. And there was a guy named David Lindley who was an incredible string instrument virtuoso. He could play he could play every kind of string instrument, and he taught banjo at the other end. There was banjo, snare drum, and the clarinet going on. He just said that I know what Keltner said, that when he met you, he thought you were one of the hippest cats he ever met.
Oh, well, that's very nice. You know, that one of the people who Jimmy hooked up with when he was teaching there was Gary Lewis's son, and Gary was taking acting lessons at the Pasadena Playhouse, and he studied with Jim, and of course Gary Lewis and the Playboys happened. And Jim was the drummer with that.
Oh, that's right. That was his first on-the-road gig, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk
think,
about? Because he was talking about. Kellner said he was just obsessed with Philly Joe, and they were just trying to emulate. He was. Can you just pull me back and talk and what you guys were specifically talking about as far as the language of jazz to that point, the vocabulary, where it was going, and how you guys wanted to add to it?
Well, it's interesting because of the people who I met in the other part of the business. I mean, Jimmy, you're speaking of that recording we made with Claire Fisher. But Jim, we used to talk about it all the time, and he was very taken with, of course, Philly Joe and Elvin Jones were quite different voices. But I remember how much he was taken with both, and he had those kind of big ears that could absorb all of that and tell what the differences were. And where he wound up with this incredible reputation for bringing a musicality to the rock and roll stuff that he did, I always thought that probably the hipness in that, or some of it came from his love of jazz early on.
No, I don't think you're wrong, man. I don't think you're wrong.
No.
I mean,
because he brought, I was just thinking, I've got the LP up in the closet. In 1973, I had to look it up. It was the movie Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid.
Sure.
Who wrote the music for that?
Well, I mean, that was Dylan. It was, and then
Dylan.
It was the Traveling Wilburys, and Keltner had his own nickname.
Well, on the record, Jimmy's name is on the LP.
Right.
And I played the recorders, and the composer, it was a Sam Peckinpah movie. And I had been playing on some movies, various woodwind instruments, and starting to work in the studios. But that movie was different from any other, because we were just called to the studio with a kind of endless call. We'll get you out here when we can, day or night. And the music was completely improvised. Dylan sat in a chair with a guitar and made things up. There were some singers and a small group, and I can't remember who all of the guitars were, but the cellist and the accordionist were all guys I'd worked in the studios with. And, of course, the Knockin' at Heaven's Door came out of that.
I mean, this is awesome. Are you telling me that Dylan went in with, I mean, it was kind of a folk rock version of Kind of Blue? I mean, no charts, nothing?
Well, absolutely not. No music. I mean, that's one thing that, I don't know, this is just a little side note, but yeah. I got a call one night from a record producer who said, I produce rock records, and he said, but what I want is a jazz alto solo on a rock record, on a straight eighth note record, and he said, I want you to play it. And it was 10 o'clock at night, and he said, come down to, and he named the studio, so I did. And then there was no music, he just played the track. I can't remember who the artist was, but I did it for him for a number of years. And he didn't want me to play any other way than the way I played. In other words, he didn't say he got a little David Sanborn side or something. And, can you tell me who it was? The producer's name was John Boylan.
And then and you were always going in there for non-jazz genre kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's no music, just 3 or 4 chord changes, and you could hear those, and he'd like it, and he'd say, well, I like the way you started that. When you take a breath there, would you just come in with something that kind of comes out of that, just basic instructions. And a lot of record producers, when you go in to do things like that, they want to kind of help you construct the solo, and that's been a habit of many people. But
no, this is I want to read you this about Stinson, and hopefully this will bring back. I want to hear about the burning jam sessions with Foster and Stinson, but this is from John Handy. After Bobby Hutcherson quit the band, I was up in San Francisco doing an opera with the San Francisco Orchestra, and had a quartet with Albert Stinson, Doug Sides, and Mike Knock. and we were doing Gunther Schuller's opera The Visitation, which was inspired by a book by Franz Kafka. During our breaks, Albert Stinson was having to throw up because he was using drugs. I had no idea, and I wasn't looking for it. After the gig, we did 3 performances. Albert had never played with a conductor conducting. He didn't know all the hand signals, so he learned his parts by memory. He had such a big, beautiful sound that at one point Gunther stopped the band and pointed at the other bass players and said, "Do you hear this?" There were about 7 other bass players, and a few of them were old enough to be Albert's father. If you know anything about Gunther, yeah, I mean, I wanted to get that. So his memory was, I mean, he could memorize that stuff. It's pretty. He was on his way, man. You know, he was a gifted cat.
Well, you know, Stinson hung out in the music store, and when I realized, Jimmy introduced me to him, and I occasionally, 2 or 3 times a month there for a period, I'd get asked to bring a dance band to play what we called a casual. And it was a matter of playing Hello Dolly and all the, the tunes of the day. And on a number of those gigs, I hired Stinson because he could play anything instantly, and it was a matter of $35 for playing for 3 or 4 hours, and we all needed that. and then the period you're talking about was later.
Sure.
I think I'm not sure how I got it, but I believe I have a CD copy of a live performance of Miles with Albert. You know that exists?
Albert played with Miles?
This is off the top of my head. I'd have to dig around.
Yeah, no, let's start. That's pretty, I mean, I know Albert, and it got recorded on a record, or this is just a bootleg kind of thing, or?
No, it was a club date that somebody got. I'll dig it out.
Yeah. No, I mean, I sent, it was so magical, Gary, because I sent when I found that LP, Keltner and I have done 2 interviews on my live radio program and have focused on similar things that we're talking about, nothing pop related for the most part. But I found this album in a thrift store on Revelation, Claire Fisher, Bobby West, Keltner, Gary Foster, and the one track that I think it's called "Going West," or I can't remember the name. It's 20-minute tune. It's the most intense tune I've ever heard in my life, and I've never heard. It's just so great to hear you playing and Claire playing, but then to hear Jimmy playing on the trap set in that style is just awe-inspiring. I mean, that to me was a golden. Whether or not you knew it or not, some people say the language of jazz died 5-6 years before that. I think that album came out in '68 or I don't know when, but I just want your perspective on that decade for you, insofar as jazz was still a popular music and it was still growing in the language.
Well, the inspiration for all of that Revelation stuff was Bill Hardy, who started Revelation Records, and that's an entire production by itself. The first record of Revelation was the guitarist Dennis Budimir and myself. And then there were a couple of trios of Dennis and Gary Peacock. And Gary Peacock was very much a presence here at the time. When I first heard Claire Fisher in 1962, Gary was his bass player. You know that?
But you just jarred my memory because I also have the Budimir Foster duo album, which is awesome. Was the emphasis from Hardy on this idea of playing these non-traditional, like, I don't know,
part of it was he was the friend in Kansas at the university. He was a world famous PhD in ornithology, and jazz was his hobby. And when Pacific Jazz, hang on a sec. When Pacific Jazz and some of the other labels here, the smaller labels, were kind of disappearing, Hardy said, "Well, I've got to do this." He said, "I don't have any money," and no money ever changed hands. It was just, if we get this next record, the money that comes in from it will pay for the next guys. And Bobby Bradford and John Carter were there. The album with a couple of albums with Claire.
Oh my God, the Bobby Bradford album with the Skipper on bass. Those albums are incredible,
That's
man.
right.
Those albums are incredible. I mean,
Well, they're
they
all gone now.
weren't trying to tailor them for a pop audience. I'll tell you that much, dude. It was so you could just be yourself, man. You know.
If Bill Hardy's, if it caught his interest musically, anybody, there were 48 records from my last one. Well, the 48 was one of mine made in Kansas City with the Kansas City musicians, all wonderful players, and it was the first record for the guitarist, and his name just slips my mind. He was a student there, and he's a big star in New York. I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, it'll come to you. That's so. From these casuals, Stinson was able to play all this pop music or surf or blues or jazz, and then. But can you talk about like were you in? I remember Keltner told me that he would show up with Jack Folks, and they'd sit in the front row.
Yeah.
Sit in the front row of the Dragonwick Club, and Bobby Hutcherson and Charles Lloyd were playing, and Lloyd dubbed them the modern jazz protégés.
That was just down the street from where the music store was. But I do remember Jack Folks, now that you mention it,
Yeah.
that I couldn't have thought of his name because that's really over 50 years ago. the other thing that I make a point of is
Sure.
that I met Claire Fisher in 1962 early, and that first encounter and the next couple, just going to his house to play, completely changed my life.
Why?
And then I've been playing with Claire, and I think by the time we made the recording with Jimmy and Bobby West, Warren Marsh had moved back here from New York for the last time. And his wife, he still didn't have any children. And I met him at a rehearsal, and I'd been getting together with Claire, and Warren and I started to play together. I think Revelation 9 was the album called Net Plus Ultra, which was Warren and me and Dave Parlato and John Tirabasso and no piano. And that record has been bootlegged, and I think it's still available on Amazon. But that was a record that got us and got me moving to learn all the Tristano material to be able to play that with Warren.
I want to go back for a second. This is so important. Why did it change your musical trajectory when you played with Claire those couple times?
Because I realized that I had been playing through instinct and through trial and error, essentially. And Claire said to me, at one point, he said, well, I can hear who your influences are. He said, when I played this chord, he said, you played the right notes. What do you think of? And I said, I think of those sounds that go there. And it was that rudimentary. And he said, you don't realize this is a melodic minor scale with starting on a certain note. And I could play all my melodic minor scales, but I wasn't using it from an intellectual standpoint. And he said, well, you have to learn all of that. And that just put a whole new requirement.
Well, who was the person you mentioned that you were channeling? I didn't catch that name.
Claire.
No, not Claire. It was some. You said it was. I don't know. Maybe it was somebody's. I have to go back and listen to it. But that's.
Well, Warren was one of those totally profound individuals. Konitz and I talked on the phone the other day, and we did a CD in 1995. Warren died in '87, and by the way, there's a marvelous biography of Warren Marsh called "An Unsung Cat." you really must see it, man.
It's a documentary or is it a book?
Oh, it's a book.
Oh, that's great.
And Warren's son is doing a documentary, and money is always a problem, but he's well into it. And those of us who were close to Warren have contributed to it. One of the most unbelievable records is one of Warren's very last performances. It's a duo with, it's called Final Interplay. It's a duo with Larry Kuntz, guitarist.
Sure.
Larry was 25 years old. And it's just not only phenomenal for Larry, but it's one of those historical records. I think if you try to buy a CD of it on Amazon, it's $700 or something.
Oh my God! Yeah, that stuff. But that is the reason it's expensive is because it is so out. It's so different. I mean, I think that people are. I guess that would be the other thing is like, I mean, can you talk a little bit about just being able to learn on the bandstand, like how, in your early career, how invigorating it was how much it helped you develop your own sound by just playing. When was your first 6-night-a-week gig? I mean, and then, do you believe that the amount of times getting up in front of 3 people or 300 people helped you develop your own original sound?
Oh, sure. And the impulse or the opportunity to get to play for somebody I was playing with during the 60s. Claire had a big band that recorded an album called Extension. I was able to get Warren to play in that sax section, and Claire wrote for the two of us. And that goes back to Atlantic Records, I think, in '68. But all of that inspiration, and we were playing dance gigs. I mean, the dumbest kind of Saturday night casuals. Claire Fisher did them, Albert Stinson did them, Kellner did them. We did it to have some income. But to play jazz in a club, and we did. We always played with Claire's band. We played at the Lighthouse for a night. I didn't play at the Lighthouse for a whole week until I played there first, I think, with Lorenzo Almeida. And we had a bossa nova quartet.
Oh, my God. Gary Foster, I mean, you are unraveling more layers of the onion every day. Well, Almeida, I'm familiar with the stuff on World Pacific with Shank and maybe Shelley. Yeah. Who was in this quartet?
Buddy Clark, who was one of the people who started Super Sax.
Right.
And Chuck Flores was the drummer. And
Chuck Flores. Is he gone? Has he left us now?
Not that I know of.
He's still around?
But,
Is he's still with us?
As far as I know, yeah. I haven't heard anything.
Gary, this is really important because, I've been studying relentlessly, going back to this period of Kenny Clark, Max Roach, these guys that really started these completely different rhythmic patterns on the drums, using more rebound, not relying so much on backbeat. Can you talk about some drummers that you worked with that influenced, that were completely unique? Because the lineage always goes from Kenny Clark to Max Roach, but I know there's a lot of unheralded cats from your generation on the West Coast that don't get that publicity. I mean, Shelley obviously, but Shelley was his own drummer. But who else would you had a big influence?
Well, first of all, Shelley was one of those people I classify not only as a wonderful musician and a wonderful friend, but in the class of truly great human being, a rare classification. But one of my first players I played with out here was Larry Bunker. And Larry knew the chords to every tune. He could sit at the piano and play them. He was a master of playing polyrhythmic stuff where he'd cross the time, but if you were holding on to the tune, listening carefully to where the chords laid, if he wasn't playing where the tune was going, he was always there with it. And he was one of the most sophisticated players. And he played the vibes well, too.
He did. He played the vibes. I love Larry Bunker. I mean...
Well, I worked in the studios with him for many, many years, and my first LP on a Japanese label on RCA Japan was a producer of Toshiko's early records. I think it was in 1976. The band hadn't been going very long, and her producer asked me to do a quartet. And I'd been playing around town with Alan Broadbent and Jim Hewitt and Larry. And that's long gone now, that LP. But, Larry was an inspiration, and he played with Claire. And, Claire loved that sophistication. And, of course, just before all of that happened, Larry left town to play with Bill Evans for a while, as you know. And, but playing at in nightclubs for a week, I played a jazz festival in Kansas City, and 1979. I played with Lee Konitz and Jimmy Nepper and the rhythm section. And coming home on the plane, Shelley and I were sitting together, and he said, you know, we euphemistically call a motion picture cue M11, which it says M11, which means music cue number 1, real 1, music cue 1. 1, 2 would be the second piece you record. So he said, we played a lot of M11 together, but we never played in the club together. I thought maybe a dream's going to come true. And he said, I got a week at the Lighthouse first week in June. He said, would you have eyes? And so there was.
Oh,
and the other person, that was Mike Walford, was the pianist, and we just walked in there and played tunes. We didn't have a repertoire, and the bass player was Chuck DeMonico, and Chuck DeMonico was in the class. Truly died very early, but he was in the class with Albert and Peacock and those guys.
I completely agree. You know, I for a long time there was this running joke that Emil Richards kept joking with me too, that Chuck Domenico and Ray Neapolitan were the same person. But in fact, Neapolitan apparently is a car salesman somewhere now. Because
where?
he's a car salesman somewhere in Southern California. I can't seem to track him down. But I'm trying to remember this one. There seemed to be this like if cats came in from the East Coast, like Gary Burton or people like that. I mean, was it you and Wofford and Bunker would be like a rhythm section at the Manhole if Shelley wasn't around? Did you used to be rhythm section?
No, I never. Oh, there was a record. Gary Burton's first LP, I believe, was not sure who played piano. It was just a quartet, but it was Larry. He played on. I think I used to have that LP.
Yeah, okay, but you're not on that, right?
No, I
okay,
never
it was
met
Wofford.
Larry.
It was Wofford, Bunker, Burton, and I don't know who was on bass. Maybe Swallow or I don't know who was.
No, I don't think so. It could have been Monty Budwig or
Monty. Oh, my God! I mean, these are like salt of the earth. I mean, how would you, if for younger generations, can you talk about the selflessness of cats like? I've never met them, you know, but I just know from the liner notes and the pictures and just the amount of doors that people like Shelley Mann open for people. How would you describe them as human beings, not even musicians?
Well, I can't say that any one of them was not a really fine person, someone enjoyable to play with. They had their own commitment to music, their own honesty in the way they played, and, you know, the town is full of those people ever more now because we have jazz education has created this entire cadre of young players, many of them who don't come to the music with the same values in terms of improvisation that I think the earlier generation did. It was, for instance, in this documentary of Warren that Warren's son is doing. We were all interviewed for it, and Lee said his comment about Warren was he was the most spontaneous improviser in the history of jazz.
Wow.
And that's pretty strong. And Lee called me once and said, what do you think? And I said, I wish I could have said it. I mean, that was, most people who know Warren's playing, I played with him hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, recorded a lot with him, played in clubs. I never heard him repeat himself. I mean, and so many of us have a way of traveling old ground, you know, and once at a clinic, someone said, Mr. Konitz, you've been playing for 50 years. How do you keep from playing isms of yours, you know, ideas that you have developed, or ways of things you've already played? And he said, if I think I'm going there, I just take the instrument out of my mouth for a moment.
Wow.
And I've experienced that with him. I mean, that's telling a story on someone, but the spontaneity and the unplanned thing in an improvised solo is always what is the thing I'm looking for, not only from myself, but from other players. And there's such a sophisticated language now in jazz that I think everybody learns. So many of the really brilliant jazz players as a base for operations are heading jazz programs at universities.
Yeah, but Gary, do you feel like younger cats, because like you had so many opportunities to fall on your face, take a chance, improvise, fall on your face, make a mistake. Like you knew that you were going to just build up your chops in a live setting where you could, the rudiments were there, the technique was there, and then you could allow the music to flow through you. Why do you account for the fact that people are much more interested in perfection and chops today as opposed to improvisation? Do you think it's because there's an anxiety about the idea of just not having as many opportunities to play anymore?
Well, I don't know. I think it's just a different mindset. If you came to the music in an earlier period, I mean, Warren and I talked about this. Warren was a man of few words, and as I started to mention, in 1995, the record producer who produced all of Toshiko's records, the band started in 73. I was in that original band.
Oh, God.
They went back to New York in 82. I think we did 11 or 12 LPs during that period, a lot of traveling all over the world. But her producer later had his own record company in Japan. And he just sent Lee and me an email one day, or not an email, in 95 it would have been a fax. And he said, you guys have never recorded together. We talked about it, but it never happened. And he said, I want to do a record, and I'll bring you to Japan. We did a tour in the Japanese rhythm section, and it's probably my phone. And anyway, we did, and we decided to do a CD as a tribute to Warren. I transcribed 7 of Warren's solos, and we played them on 2 altos. They're all based on standards, but they were our solos, and the record's gone now. I mean, I have a computer, but anyway, it was fun. And Shelley, which came out of having worked with him a lot at the Ice House.
Welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show, part 2 here with Gary Foster, multi-reed maestro and ethnomusicology. I mean, just a collector of music and a lover and a player. In 1967, you lost track of Albert. When was the last time you saw him?
Would have been before that.
So after those casual gigs, he headed off to the Bay Area and he died up there.
Yeah.
Wow.
I would guess Kellner would be a better person to know exactly when he left.
Right. I wanted to ask you about maybe in your mind a period in your career where you had to overcome some adversity. Maybe it was learning a new style, or you were just kind of fighting it for whatever reason, and how you overcame it and how it made you stronger.
Well, the total of my education, formal education, from that period in the late 50s until 1961, when I told you about it yesterday, was all as a classical musician, because I was, I believe, quite fortunate enough not to have been able to study jazz and not classical, because the school didn't really want to give a degree in performance, but mine was in clarinet. And the adversity, if there was any, was when I came here. That was my biggest asset, because there were so many jazz players and good ones. And the one thing, after I played on some recordings with Claire, he wrote me some very lovely clarinet solos that were right out of the contemporary classical idiom. And most of the doublers who were here, people who doubled, and there's a legion of them, and they're all wonderful players. But most of them did not like to play the clarinet with some of the demands that the films put on it. And so that was an asset. And one of those young players who was with us, multiple woodwind player who was very good, named John Lowe. He's not well known, but he said to me one day, "Did you ever think about playing the flute?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you could probably work as a doubler in the studios." So I asked around who had taught some of the people who did it, and they all had studied with one of the fellows in the LA Philharmonic, so I went to him. And the contractor who put the dates together for Claire for his early band recordings and an orchestral recording for Columbia that was in the 60s too. And he called me one night and he said, I've got a movie I'd like to have you play, second clarinet. And it was second clarinet to one of the great players here. And I went, and that opened the door, and I started studying the flute. And then one day this contractor called me and he said, would you play classical clarinet on this movie and second flute? Well, the second flute was fine by then. I was hesitant to do it before that, but this was a couple of years later, and I'd been working hard on the flute. And in that process, I sat next to, on that particular series, and I can't remember what it was, old TV from the late 60s, I sat next to several of the great concert flutists. And if you learned in the jazz tradition with your ears and with your trial and error approach and play along with records, I started playing along with the records of all the great solo flute players. And you absorb a great deal by doing it. I've recommended it to students and to other players as a way. It's like playing along with Stan Getz or Bird or somebody else, but in the classical flute style. So that opened the door to me there. I think it was in 1971. I was invited to be the first woodwind player on the Carol Burnett show, which went for basically another 10 years. And that was a chair, essentially a jazz band with strings. And I played piccolo and flute, soprano sax, clarinet, alto sax.
So I guess, I mean, like, would you consider that to be a time of adversity, learning the flute, or?
Oh no, I wouldn't say it was adversity because I was teaching and had income. But the flute, or any instrument that you begin to learn after your physical growing up, perhaps. I mean, I was about 25 or 26, 27 when I started the flute. That's kind of late. And I would say it was an adversity because the other thing is I played the clarinet in a certain way. There are two ways of playing the clarinet. This is incidental, but with your teeth on top of the mouthpiece or with your lips on top of the mouthpiece and on the bottom of the reed. And I had played that way, and that causes the flute embouchure to be very desensitized. Once I learned that, the flute picked up. It's kind of technical, but no, I don't think that I never felt that there was an adversity because, as I told you yesterday, our moving here was done just out of the choice to live our dream to come to place where the music, where you could play music for a living. And I think that essentially it's still that way in New York and Los Angeles the same. And then everything's changing greatly, but
well, let's stay with that for a minute. During the time that you and your wife decided to move there, you couldn't make a living in playing music in any other urban center besides New York and L.A.?
Oh, I was doing well in Kansas. I was playing mostly dance jobs, at university.
So you're talking about playing jazz. You're talking about playing jazz, though.
Yeah, playing tunes of the day, and when we could sneak in a jazz tune.
No. I'm saying you wanted to follow your heart and your dream. You could make a living playing jazz in New York and Los Angeles. That's why you moved there. You moved to L.A.
Essentially, and I didn't tell you this, but the Man Hall was the big club here, and all the local guys played. They didn't charge very much to get in, and no cover or anything. I think a cup of coffee was $1.60. I'm serious. I later thanked Shelley profusely, and he said, I wanted people to come to hear the music, not to make money on. And I doubt that he did. But in any case, I've told this story, I think. But going to Shelley's many, many times and going out and looking at the parking lot, I saw the guys coming out, Bud Shank and Shelley and other people, driving really nice cars. And I was also told what a person was paid to play 4 hours at Shelley's, which was practically nothing. And I thought they must be doing something else. And then I met Claire and learned what the studio business was. So I redirected, and I feel that, to put it, in not too many words, I've been a jazz musician who wanted to play jazz, and I have all over the world and with great players. But I've essentially, for nearly 50 years, until that business changed, I made my living playing flute, clarinet, and saxophone for movies. And on many movies, I've played second clarinet to a great first single clarinet player. And in the movie, the arrangers would always say, we have to have an alto saxophone solo when a pretty girl comes on the screen. So they'd hire a saxophone player who could play classical clarinet or second flute. And for years we did those cartoon shows at Warner Brothers, the most difficult music you can imagine. And that was flute and clarinet and all of that.
Why was it? Because you had to do, like, you had to create different scenes, like with Flintstones scenes and like different pattern. Like, I mean, why was it difficult to do that? The cartoons.
Music was all written, of course, but it was just technically very demanding on the page.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't music we faked or made up. I told you about being fortunate enough never to be asked to play David Sanborn or something. I loved the way he played, but I couldn't affect that or make my mind alter to do that.
No, I dig it. I mean, I look at. I don't necessarily listen to the records a lot, but I mean, I collect a lot of records, and I see those rock albums, straight eighths, where they brought in jazzers to play, and it's just cool that those producers of those albums really were not micromanaging you. They just wanted you to play jazz on it,
Well, there are players here in town who came after me and who could hear all of that, Michael Becker and Sanborn and those players. And if somebody in a booth said, "I need 16 bars of Michael Becker before we end this tune," several of those players could say, "Which record would you like me to have heard?" They simply had all of that stored away. And if I had any asset beyond playing jazz the way I like to play it, it was a classical background. Fortunate to have it.
Can you, when I interviewed Charles Lloyd and he went out to USC, he said that very little of the jazz curriculum at that time or music education at that time paid any attention to the great African American leaders of jazz, guys like Duke Ellington. I just wanted you to, from your perspective, somebody that grew up in a bastion of regional music like Kansas City, which produced Basie and you and Nathan Davis, Carmel Jones, and the list goes on and on. Do you feel that the African American contributions to this art form have ever been fully recognized in academia?
Well, no, I don't. And I've had instances where, with one composition teacher in graduate school, I mentioned in a graduate seminar something about Duke Ellington, and he said, "Well, that's jazz." He said, "That we can't take that seriously." I had an argument with him. I said, when I was 14, and what to be 1949, Bird with Strings was released. And I'd heard Charlie Parker before that. I was listening to Duke Ellington and listening to classical music. And I thought, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, those musicians were as brilliant, no matter what the color of their skin were, as any classical musician. And of course, I think we've gone through a period where things have gotten better. I still don't think they're as good as it should be. But I think what you said, Charles said, certainly correct.
Why would you had an argument? You advocated for that for Bird, but where does that mindset come from? That idea of just being able to say we can't take it seriously.
I thought as a young person in the Midwest, which is still perhaps a very prejudiced place compared to what it should be.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the prejudice there, I had a grandfather who I liked very much, but he was one of the most prejudiced people against everything you could possibly say. And I first once defended at a dinner, I was probably 14, what I just said to you. And he said, oh, no, those people have no place in the world, and it was because of their color. And I could still take you to places in the Midwest where that essentially is an attitude that prevails.
Right. Was that one? Was subconsciously? Do you feel like that was another reason you and your wife moved out of there?
No.
Okay. No, I dig. I just, to me, it's like at 38 years old, I still see this cultural bias, whatever you want to call it. Some people call it racism. It's so rooted. And people are
I see it every day.
Yeah, and people are so knee deep in it. They're so deep into the forest they don't even see it themselves if they are like that. And that's the most disturbing part, is that it's not about self-realization or improvement or trying to grow or understand. It's just you're rooted in this hackneyed, eternal original sin that goes back to slavery, and the guilt is just overpowering, and they can't spin out of it. And it's just, with Obama as president, it's become highlighted even more. And it's, with a couple of factors here, we're going to be veering off the cliff very soon if we don't steady ourselves here.
Amen.
When was the first time you actually I know you played on this incredible, all of the albums that Gary Foster played on as a leader, or, a lot of high-end, very expensive albums, hard to find. I know you played on this album with Cal Tjader called, Horizon, there's from 1978. But I wanted to know, the first Huracan. Every time I find that album, it's $25, $30, $40, $50. It's like I can't afford.
Well, here's what that. You remember the period where people made a recording called direct to disc?
Well, I definitely see many of those. I have Thelma Houston and all the Harry James. Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that period. Claire Fisher was playing with Cal, and Cal was going to make a direct-to-disc record, and I think Claire put me on it. As I recall, Rossellino was on it, and Willie Bobo, and we did it. There was a very bad feeling in the room that came from Claire having written some very complicated music that really didn't go with the Latin feel that I think everybody else expected it to be. And that was just one of those records that occurred and went away. That brought me to Cal, and he started calling me to do things with him. And one of my most enjoyable times was a period in, I think it was 1981, when we traveled some. And he was always very understanding that if he'd call and say, can you do the second 2 weeks of next month and go to New York or somewhere? And if I had a movie that was really going to pay for our lives, and I said, Cal, can you take somebody else? He would always be comfortable. In fact, I didn't go to the Philippines with him on the trip where he died.
Wow.
Because I had a big movie that was going to go. But we talked on the phone almost every day, and we made a live record after doing a lot of work. We made a live recording called A Fuego Vivo, The Fast Fire, at the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco. And that's how a record should be made. We'd been playing in clubs, every track on that record. And I heard all of the takes. I think we did 3 or 4 nights, and any one of the performances could have been on the record. And then we did.
I think Ramon Banda was on drums or timbales or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mons was a drummer, and Poncho, of course, was still a sideman.
Yeah, no, what was cool, I remember there was one, that was a great, that album smokes, and there's one track where the two of them just have a call and response between the congas and just burning stuff. And I always just found, Cal really helped bridge or fuse the language of Latin salsa music with jazz. And he did it in such a hip way, and he always seemed to know how to continue to evolve and maybe who he hadn't touched or hadn't connected with yet. And I think it's just, it's a credit to his genius, coming out of that.
Well,
Yeah.
speaking of that, which you wouldn't know, Claire and I know, or Claire and I knew, is that everything that came out of Cal was completely natural. He didn't want to rehearse. He didn't practice. He didn't take the vibes out of the truck at his house. And when we prepared that music for Great American, we played it for a week at what was called Concerts by the Sea, Howard Rumsey's house, a place here. And we went in the club the first afternoon and rehearsed through the stuff. We played it all that night and forever after. And by the time we played it at Great American, it was just like everything was natural. And that's how a record should be made. So now you can go in the studio. I have a friend recently, I won't name, who made a record, and he put all of his solo parts onto what they call it, the synthesizer. He put a metronome on, he recorded all of the melodies, and then the improvised solos all by himself, and then if anything needed correcting, he corrected it. And then he put a bass and piano and drums on underneath everything he had already done. And it was this jazz statement. Well, it's certainly not making music with other players like we did in the old days,
That to me is happening in large quantities all over the world now, and it's really humbling and not. I mean, it's just. I don't want to say disgraceful because everyone's got to sing for their supper, but it's like I mean, I don't know how that. It must be one of the most sterile sounding things that would ever be heard ever. I mean, you can't. It's a chop shop. I mean, I guess. Did you cross paths? You talk about picking up the flute. My favorite flutist is Sam Most. Did you cross paths with Sam?
Many, many times. I knew him. I loved him very much. He was just a lovely man. His brother, Abe.
Yes.
Was a great clarinet player, and I worked many jobs with him, films and things. And in fact, about 20 years ago, the International Clarinet magazine asked me, and they do very few profiles of jazz musicians, but they asked me if I would do a profile of Abe. And I knew him well and interviewed him several times and wrote an article. And he was one of those players who bridged the gap from swing Arab to bebop. He played with the big Arab big bands, but he had a lot of modern harmony in his playing, and he was just a great cat, and he lived to be quite old. Sam, I talked to Sam. I had just done a tour a few years ago in Holland with Ryan de Graaf, great piano player, and when I got back, Sam called and said that Ryan had asked him to do the next tour. And what was the tour like? And I think Sam was a bit concerned about being comfortable physically because, it was a tour and you're moving a lot. But Ryan really takes wonderful care of everybody, so he did it. And as it turned out, a record came out of it. It's released in Europe.
What about Kent Glenn?
Well, I knew Kent. I don't know what really happened to him. My friend Putter Smith and he were very close.
Yeah, I love Putter so much. No, I mean, because the skipper used to do a lot of work with Kent Glenn. There's just a lot of these, to me, Shelly Manne, you see these pictures of him with Yankee pinstripes on, and it almost seemed like it was a baseball team. You had utility players and corner infielders and catchers, guys that were mainstays, but all these guys that were greasing the wheels, and there was all these opportunities. I mean, to me, it's like those opportunities have really halted now. And I wonder, in your mind, how, in this sort of bottom line society that we live in now, more than ever before, what are some things that can be done by modern improvisational players to get out of their bedroom and get out of, electronics and help reinvigorate live music?
Well, I think many of the young players who come on the scene. Do you see the website called Jazz? What is it called?
Probably not, but anyway, go ahead.
But it's there every day, and it has everything you'd want to know about jazz that's happened in the last 24 hours. The birthdays of all the musicians.
Okay, right on. Right.
And it has reviews, and there are anywhere from 4 to 6 reviews every day, 7 days a week, of new recordings. Most of them are self-produced by people who simply have to. I mean, the writers used to say, publish or perish. And I understand it completely. It certainly isn't like being in the world where Carl Jefferson called up and said, let's make a record. Or, well, he was around. The Cal Jader stuff was for his record company. But I had an album with Jimmy Rolls that was recently in the Jazz Profiles website. Put up a tune from there with a photo montage. It was very nice.
Oh,
Surprised
nice
to see that. But I don't know. If anything, it's to return to the. It's a silly answer, probably, but to return to the aesthetic principles of what improvisation was really about in the beginning. I mean, I think so many of the older players. I remember one night going in New York when we were there with Toshiko's band, going to hear one of the most famous trumpet players, and he was just shucking through the whole evening and clowning and everything. And there were a number of us who were serious musicians, and we went to hear a hero. And he said later, somebody said, "Hey man, why were you playing the way you did tonight? You had a lot of musicians." And he said, "Oh God, if I'd have known I had musicians in the house, I'd have really tried to play." So he was shucking to make a living,
Wow.
And that was somebody very historical. And, you could tell he could play and was glad to be there. But those are the days when in New York, Compton's was there in the 70s still. And a lot of the clubs, you could just walk in and they were there. I remember one night in New York, my wife and I and Lee Konitz, this is probably 40 years ago, we went to dinner. And we were staying right in Midtown, and she decided that she thought she'd turn in for the night. And it was probably about 10 o'clock, and Lee said, "What do you want to do?" And I think we were probably around 56th and 7th Avenue, right by Carnegie Hall. And I said, "Oh, I'd love it if we could just walk and show me where everything was in the late 40s and the 50s. And we walked for an hour and a half, and he said, "Oh, this is where the basement apartment was with Gil Evans, where we rehearsed Birth of the Cool."
Wow.
And he said, "This is where I lived, and this is where Lenny Tristano's teaching studio was, and this is where the Onyx was, and the clubs." And, it was just a thrill to get a first-hand look at it. A lot of it, high-rise office buildings now.
Yeah, well, gentrification's in full effect, and obviously there's been a lot of divisions. I mean, it's hard to just. I also think guys like George Wein and Howard Rumsey, who's a player himself, and Orrin Keepnews, and these guys could hear they could hear the language that you guys were creating and adding on to. And I don't know today really if the producers and the people that have the purse strings if they really even hear it or think it's valuable. And that's part of the issue. It's not even about the players themselves, who are probably trying to bend over backwards to, be improvisational. And now there's 100 years of jazz out there anyway. It's just there were cats that adhered to the idea that this was not this was music, and it was important to society and culture, and the players deserve to be compensated. On top of that, but I think you'll be the first. You just said it before with Cal. I mean, you fed your family. You survived by, working in the studios, which it basically is non-existent today compared to back then. I mean, there were sessions, I'm sure, that you went in before the sun and came out, and the sun had already gone down.
Yeah, and yes, of course, and with many memorable players who are gone. I knew Howard probably the second week I lived here. We were staying in Bill Hardy's house, who eventually founded Revelation Records. Carmel, who had come a year before, was living in the basement, and my wife and I and our child had a room on the first floor, and we stayed there 2 weeks. Carmel had already been there, And he said, well, one of the first things we have to do is to go to the lighthouse. So the three of us, Hardy, and we went to the lighthouse, and of course, the minute Howard saw Carmel, he said, this is 1961. He said, Carmel, you got your horn? And Carmel said, yeah, sure. And Howard, who was a lovely man, he said, do you play? And I said, yeah, I play the saxophone. He said, get your horn. And I never went in there in the next year or so as I went to hear groups. I never went in that he didn't say, get your horn and sit in. He did it with everybody.
Wow.
And there's a photo there at the lighthouse still of a high school band which Charles Lloyd played in. High school combo, and Howard's pictures with him.
Yeah, I mean, when Miles came out in the 50s, he didn't have a place to stay. He stayed at Howard's house for a week. You know, it's like...
Sure he did.
I mean, you know, it was a beautiful community, Gary, and, you know, it was a...
You mentioned Orrin.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, you mentioned Orrin Keaton. I've made many records with a singer and her husband, Mike Greensill, and Wesley Whitfield for High Note Records. And it was a small group. It was usually Michael Moore and Joe LaBarbera and myself and the two of them, Mike and Wesley. And Orrin was the producer. And so I got to know him well over a period of about 6 or 7 years in the late 90s. And I don't know if you know the 1963 recording called Soulmates. It was Joe Zawinul and Ben Webster.
Wow, I don't know that one.
Don't miss it. Well, it's not only the best part, but the best part, I bought it in 1963. And the liner notes are written by Bill Evans. And the first night I was working for Orrin, we had dinner, and I said, I've always had a question I wanted to ask you. How'd you happen to ask Bill Evans to write the liner notes for Soulmates? His eyes opened wide, and he said, you know that. And then he told me that Bill had signed to go to, it may have been when he signed to go to Verve, and he owed them something, another record, and it was needed money. And if you haven't seen it, I'll copy it and put it in with the CD. It's the history of jazz and how important those people were. Did you ever see the letter, 3-page letter in his own handwriting that Sonny Rollins wrote in 1962 to Coleman Hawkins?
Absolutely not. I have not. But I want to be clear. He instead of cutting an album, Bill wrote the liner notes for this Zawinul Ben Webster album.
Yeah. And they're the most lucid.
Send me any of that stuff you want. To me, this is a very. I mean, it's just getting deeper and denser and more intense.
Well, I just feel like some of those things are for me and for other people, especially for students that I've had over the years. If you expose them to the thinking of great musicians, you'll be shocked when you read it.
No, exactly. No, it's the abstractions and the thinking, breaking that mold of conformity